Hello, and welcome to Not Very Scary Stories. Tonight's episode will be more stories from around the internet. Tonight, all 3 stories are from a subreddit called r/nosleep. Keep in mind, these stories can be fiction or non-fiction. So I'll leave it up to you to believe whether these are fake or true. Be sure to leave a sub, follow, or whatever you can on whatever platform you're on. Also, be sure to leave a review as well, so people will know to listen. I'd like to thank you guys for the support thus far on all platforms you can find us on, including YouTube. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you have any scary stories or experiences you'd like to share, email me at darksky@gmail.com and tell me how you'd like to be credited. I'm Zenith Darksky, and I'll be your host tonight. Enjoy. The first story was posted by user Scary Small Doll on r/nosleep. It is titled, "I just got laid off at Disneyland, so I am free to talk about the Strollers." I just got the email now, even though it was sent a few days ago. I'm laid off. Thought they would be nicer about it if they were nice in the worst way. So now that I'm looking for new work, I crashed at my sister's apartment. She just got tested, so we're all in lockdown in her apartment until the 10 days are up, even after the results, in case it's a false negative. So in that time, she let me use her home computer, and I have the time to talk. I was thinking about some stories my old Disneyland coworker Scott told me. They were pretty funny. One of them was back at a hot summer day. He was working near Splash Mountain and someone looked drenched and he made a comment like, "Gotta love getting wet out there." "Excuse me?" the large and wide woman asked. Now, he was only assuming they had gone on the ride, so when the woman was upset that she was sweating, he felt the hammer drop like he was a little kid again in trouble. He was literally reported to the manager. And this was before we threw around the Karen vernacular. We call this the big wet bitch story. The next story Scott actually liked telling is about his family at the gift shop where security cameras later caught a 3-year-old girl shoplifting a Minnie Mouse hat, and that both parents unknowingly looked at each other and smirked. Not because they knew it was stolen, it was most likely that each one thought the other had bought it for her, so they walked out of the park before he could contact them. An innocent story. Aiden had a real feel-good story about a hospital patient who met her favorite Disney princess. Honestly, I don't have the words to describe when dreams really do come true for someone before the end. Honestly, his story may be harder for me to tell you than Mark's. Mark was one of the older workers at the park and the oldest I ever talked to. The guy was 73, so he can tell his fuzzy memories of the first years the park was open and he was pushed in a stroller. He remembers his mom leaving him in the stroller and how this tall man stood by his stroller to watch him. The man wasn't a family member or even a mascot, but what stuck out to him was that he was arrogant. He doesn't remember if he dressed nice, but that wasn't it. Like, that was the vibe he gave off, even though the memory is really hazy. He remembers feeling like this man has a dark sense of confidence and that he could get away with anything. The man reached toward him, but right at the moment his mother came out from the bathroom and took him away from that strange and confident man. As the years rolled by, he found himself working at the park. As he was stacking the park strollers, he was just about done when he found the last one. He felt a presence. Standing near the stroller was a woman who, like the confident man, looked into the child in the seat, and at first he thought that this was the mother. That was over when the mother ran towards them both, shouting. He called security and had the strange woman taken away. Now, once in a while, as he was putting strollers away, someone would call out to him and ask for his attention. Every time he did, they started a long conversation asking about where certain rides or places were and are and the changes to the park and thanking him for his time. By the time he got back, nothing unusual happened. So he went about the next days doing the same thing. One day, as he was stacking the carts and strollers, he counted that one was missing. Odd. Perhaps it was near a ride queue. It wasn't. Since it was only one, he let it slide and went back home until his next shift. It wasn't until a few days when the same thing would happen once in a while. At least it felt like it didn't happen every day. So why worry? He had no idea where the missing strollers went, and he didn't care. As the years went by, he lost track of when this would happen, how long it has been since the last time it happened, until pretty soon, he was numb to it. Several strollers were missing a month every year, and since there were still more than enough to go around, nobody said anything to him. Besides, they sometimes ordered more. So that was when he told himself he didn't care and it shouldn't bother him. Around that time, he was transferred to the new California Adventure Park and worked at the Bugs Life area. He's been working at California Adventure ever since. So one night in 2016, he tells us about these missing strollers. When we ask why does he tell us so late and why now, he gives his reason. Mark said he was on a long road trip by himself. It was getting really late. He was running out of gas. There wasn't a city or even a street light for miles. He was in the middle of nowhere. That was all he knew. He pulled over and took a nap in his car. That night, in the dark of the desert, he felt the warm wind blow through the cold night. It was difficult for him to sleep. That was when he heard it. A loud, unearthly series of cries in the dark. Distant screams echo in the night. If he could listen carefully, he said, each almost sounded like a baby crying. Although he said he hadn't ruled out that he was hearing coyotes or some other animal make a similar sound. The next morning, his car wouldn't start. He got out and began to push it down the road in neutral when an old beat-up pickup pulled in next to him, and this dirty little teenage boy with a big toothy grin asked if he needed a lift to town. He said he needed a tow, but the kid just looked at him like he hadn't heard that word before. As they went over and around the large mesa, Mark realized that they were going off-road. This is a shortcut to town. As a matter of fact, it's the only shortcut to town. They pulled into a quaint little town with a sense of peace and safety there. Mark didn't know what to think. The people there were very hospitable to him, and he couldn't bring himself to feel any discomfort. He tried calling, but the reception died and there were no cell phone towers. He asked if there was a phone he can use, and everyone in town would look at him the same funny way, not knowing what he was even talking about and trying to change the subject. As a matter of fact, nobody had a phone, and no place even had a TV. The only electric outlet was rusted over with the frame chipped off, and the only use was to help him pump the gas he desperately needed into a gallon can. People offered him a ride in that same pickup to and back from his car, as they looked like they had never taken anyone else in that pickup in months. However, as clueless technology-wise as the townspeople were, they were so friendly and charming that Mark didn't care much about that. It gave him the feeling of how places used to be, when everyone knew each other on a first-name basis, that kind of thing. Anyway, as he drove off past the town, he took off his hat and waved goodbye, and they were all smiles and begged him to stay. He had to keep going, so he said his farewells, and that was all he ever saw of that town. He tried finding it again, even took the same roads, but it was all just desert. What he told us next chilled us in the back of our necks. Let me see if I can remember how he put it in his own words. Funny thing, after I drove past that town, my car almost fell off into a canyon that cracked in the floor like from out of nowhere. Luckily, I backed up just in time to pull out safely before gravity did its dirty work. We all laughed, but the story wasn't over. And you wouldn't believe how many strollers I saw at the bottom of that canyon. This next story is titled Church Lady, posted by user ASChad740 on r/nosleep. I awoke early Sunday morning to the sound of my mom's high-heeled dress shoes clacking down the wooden stairs. I stayed up late Saturday night clearing dungeons in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. She dragged me out of bed and forced me to put on my Sunday best for 9 a.m. Mass. During Mass, I sat and stood at all the right times and garbled out a few words when the congregation was expected to say something. For those of you who are not Christian or, like me, haven't been to a church in many years, near the end of a Christian Mass, the priest invites the congregation to give each other a sign of peace. The crowd erupts into loud murmurings of "Peace be with you," followed by "and also with you," as the congregants shake hands, hug, crack jokes, and emit coffee breath into the air. I hugged my parents and politely shook the hand of the man standing in the row behind me. I then turned around and braced myself for the last boring part of Mass before we walk up for communion, and my family slips out through the side door. Almost done. My parents were still shaking hands and making small talk with their neighbors when the woman in front of me turned around and gave me a broad smile. She looked to be in her late 70s, was sharply dressed in a bright green old lady suit, the kind Queen Elizabeth wears. She extended her hand to me and said, "You smell just like your grandfather." Never breaking eye contact, I shook her hand and gave her a weak smile as she slowly turned back around. I didn't think much of it. I was 12 years old at the time, and I understood that senile old women flocked to church like flies to a fresh piece of dog shit. The priest began the communion ceremony. The congregation quieted down. Shortly after, I was back home, untucking my dress shirt and getting ready for a day of playing video games and eating junk food. Unlike church, my time spent gaming flew by. I looked at the clock and saw 10 p.m. Time for bed. One perk of having a ground floor bedroom was I could fall asleep to the sound of crickets chirping outside the window beside my bed. I drifted off to sleep quickly. When I woke up, I was surprised to see it was still dark out. I looked at my alarm clock and the red digital numbers showed 4:20 a.m. The crickets were no longer chirping, and I was painfully aware of the dense silence in my room. I ignored it and laid my head back down, pleased that I could snag a few more hours of shut-eye. I was drifting back to sleep when I heard a distant giggle. My eyes shot open. I focused all my energy on listening through the dead silence. Another giggle. A little louder this time. I looked around my room, checking to see if I left something on. My TV was off, N64 was off, Game Boy Color was off. None of my toys made noise. My parents usually fall asleep with the TV on, so another giggle. It was loud enough now that I could pinpoint the source to my backyard. I froze in place, felt the blood rushing to my limbs, and spent the next few minutes deciding if I should lay still in my bed and pray for sunrise, or sit up, peek through the shutters, and see what was making the noise. After a few minutes of contemplation, I decided that whatever was making this noise was probably some benign thing like a critter calling out, or maybe a raccoon got a hold of a dog toy. I kept thinking of the episode of SpongeBob when Squidward thinks someone is spying on him, but it turns out to be a piece of coral scraping against his house. Squid's day off. Still, I wanted to find the source. I sat up, took a deep breath, and peered through the blinds, not daring to open them or move them. I saw my backyard faintly illuminated by the orange glow of a nearby streetlight. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I scanned around the yard and saw a few toys scattered around the grass. The little slide and swing set I hadn't touched since I was 8, the uncoiled garden hose, the old stone fountain with no water running through it. I felt better seeing that it obviously wasn't something serious. All the same, what I heard was weird as hell, and I intended to explain what happened to my parents later. I decided I should pull the blinds up to take a better look at the yard so I could honestly tell them I looked everywhere. I turned to reach for the cord and saw the old woman from church staring at me. She was standing outside on a planter box beside my window, wearing the same outfit from the day before. She looked down at me with bulging eyes and a huge smile. I froze and stared back at her. My brain turned off. All I could do was stare. After what felt like hours, she said, "Will you let me in?" I came back to life and sprinted to my parents' room. They were awake before I reached them, asking me for an explanation. I said there was a lady outside my window, My dad gave me a dry look but humored me by going to my room and taking a peek out the window. He saw nothing and told me all those video games are giving me nightmares. I begged him to call the police, but he rolled his eyes, told me to go back to sleep. I slunk back to my room and sat in my beanbag chair with my eyes fixed on the window. School time couldn't come soon enough. This next story was posted by user/head of Spectre on r/nosleep. It's titled, "My brother and I went hunting. Something followed us back." Ask enough hunters in Appalachia and sooner or later someone will tell you that the deer, or some folks call them, not deer. Most folks say they look more or less like normal deer, but there's always something off about them. Something not quite right that you can't fully put your finger on until later. Usually, it's the legs. Some folks say they're on backwards. Others say they walk on two legs or their whole heads are on backwards, while the others can see it in their eyes. Something that sets them apart from the rest of the herd. Something that can make even seasoned hunters turn tail in terror. A lot of people explain these things away by reminding us of the simple fact that deer are weird fucking animals. There's a modern image of deer as these graceful, tranquil things, when really they're just remarkably stupid, surprisingly aggressive, and most of all, just plain strange. I always figured that a lot of the supposed sightings of deer can be chalked up to that, although after some of what's happened recently, I'm not quite stupid enough to straight up state that there's no such thing. I've seen them too, and I know what I saw was one of them. There's a very clear line between the regular kookiness of your average deer and those things out there that are very much not deer, and I've seen what's on the other side of that line. I've seen more than my fair share. It was only about a month or so back when my brother Arlen and I headed out for our own little weekend hunting trip. It was near the ass end of August, and would be our last weekend together until Thanksgiving, so we wanted to make it count. Right after Labor Day, we'd be back in the city and back to our studies at UGA. A little weekend hunt was more or less tradition for us and had been ever since I'd left home. It was a tradition I'd come to love. Arlen and I had been hunting with our dad for most of our lives, and while he was getting a bit too old for it, the two of us were still in the prime of our youth. We visited our usual spot, a quiet little hunting ground in the middle of nowhere, and came ready to rough it for a few days. Arlen and I shot shit as we parked his truck and unloaded our stuff into the little cabin we usually rented. Our little trip was off to a normal enough start, and before the sun had gotten too high, we'd made our way into the woods to see what we could find. Things were off to a decent enough start when we found tracks not too far from our cabin. They were fairly fresh, and using them, we crept up on what must have been a group of about 4 to 6 deer. Given the small size of the herd, that probably meant we were on the trail of some bucks, and that could only be good for us. We kept quiet as we tracked the animals, and for a good while we stayed on their trail, slowly gaining on them as they wandered the woods. Couldn't have been more than an hour or so before I spotted movement through the trees. Tall, proud horns moved amongst the foliage, and I watched them closely. From my vantage point, I counted about 4 bucks. They seemed not to notice us and glazed lazily as Arlen and I studied them before planning our shots. From my angle, I could easily put a bullet in its heart. It would be quick and probably painless. Arlen had a good shot on another one of the bucks a little further away. Its body was positioned just right. If we timed it perfectly, we might have gone home with 2 bucks on our first day out. Not a bad haul at all. I steadied my rifle as I trained it on the heart of the nearest deer, and my finger rested on the trigger, ready to squeeze it before the damn thing moved. Its head shot upright as if it had heard a noise, and its eyes fixated on me and Arlen. We were hidden in the foliage, so it really shouldn't have seen us so easily. Smelled us, maybe, but not seen. Yet it stared at us all the same. I mentioned before that some folks know a deer when they look in their eyes, and looking into the eyes of the buck, I knew something was off. It's hard to fully describe, but the color seemed wrong. The eyes looked blue, but a vibrant, ice-cold blue. Beside me, I felt Arlen tense up, and I knew he saw exactly what I was seeing. The heads of the other deer turned to look at us as well, moving in a slow unison that sent a chill through me. When faced with danger, people either run or they fight, and every nerve in my body was telling me to run in that moment, but I held my ground all the same, and I stared into the icy blue eyes of the deer. The blue-eyed buck rose onto its hind legs. It did so with relative ease, and as it did, I noticed something odd about the shape of its body. Its limbs seemed just a little too long. Its front legs hung limply in front of it as its eyes remained trained on me. Its mouth opened, and from it came a surreal, chittering noise. It sounded almost like a child on helium, uttering complete nonsense, and yet that combined with its unblinking glare made me want to shrink back. Arlen lowered his rifle and pulled away quickly. "Christ, come on, Mikey, let's get out of here." He nudged my shoulder, but I didn't budge. I kept my rifle trained on that thing. Whatever it was, it babbled madly. Then it took a single step towards me. I jolted backwards. As I did, I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the creature dead in the chest. It was a shot that should have blown through its heart and killed it dead. Any normal deer would be dead, but that thing just continued to stand and chitter. The impact of the shot didn't even faze it or cause it to sway. It remained perfectly upright and took another step towards me, eyes still fixated on me, a condescending mockery in its posture. And as it took its third swaying step, I saw its lips curl back like a snarling dog, and what was behind them was a set of jagged, gnarled teeth that looked more like a dog's than a deer's. They jutted out of the gums at odd angles, and that should have made it impossible for it to have ever kept its mouth closed in the first place. Wet saliva dribbled down its chin, and I finally gave in to my fear and pulled back. Arlen tugged at my arm, and I didn't even fight him for 1 second. I let him lead me away from those things, and together we raced deeper into the woods. Far behind me, I could hear that hellish chittering growing louder and louder, like mocking laughter. No matter how far we seemed to run, we never quite escaped it. Arlen and I didn't leave the cabin for the rest of the day. We told ourselves we'd just run into some weird, overly aggressive buck, and that we'd be fine the next day. I think we both knew we were lying. Even the cabin didn't feel quite safe. We had it for a few days, but we didn't even last one. He'd seen me put a goddamn bullet through that fucking deer, and it hadn't even blinked. I'd probably have wounded that thing more if I blew a fucking raspberry on its stomach. As the sky began to darken, the woods felt more and more unfriendly. From the corner of my eye, I kept swearing I saw horns moving amongst the foliage, and while it was probably just my imagination, I didn't like the idea of waiting to find out for sure. "Do you think it might just be best to head home?" Arlen asked as we shared supper, a simple pair of TV dinners. "Just say that we aren't feeling too hot. I got the runs or something like that." I picked up my microwave chicken and gave a quiet nod. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'm all for that if you are, man. It might just be better if we pack it up now." That was all that was needed to be said on the matter. We barely even finished our dinners before we got our shit packed up and got the hell out of there. Not much of a hunting trip, but considering how our little encounter had set the mood, could anyone really blame us for hightailing it out of there? That was easily the smartest thing we could have done at the time. I'd hoped that those strange deer would soon be nothing but a bad memory. Boy, was I wrong. Arlen and I were back in Griffin and ready to get on with another semester. The things we saw in the woods were only a sour memory in our minds, soon to become another cryptid tale we shared at parties. I, for one, was more than happy to move on with my life and hopefully never again need to think about those creatures. My classes started in the afternoon and went until fairly late in the evening. My first was in a lecture hall I'd been in before, a plain room with a large window overlooking the campus. Nothing all that spectacular, but it was nice enough. I'd gotten to class early, so I found a seat by the window. First day lectures were never the most interesting, but at least I'd have a nice view, right? The University of Georgia has a pretty nice campus, and that window offered a great view of it. When the professor came in and started the usual beginning of semester spiel, I only half listened to it and took down a few notes as I watched the comings and goings of people on the campus. It was a decent enough distraction while I worked. It didn't full out steal my attention until I saw the shape moving in the distance. I only caught a glimpse of it, and it was a little too far away to see clearly, but when I glimpsed it from the corner of my eye, I turned my head to do a double take. Far away, close to the road, I could see something that I could have sworn was a deer standing by one of the buildings. As far as I could tell, no one else but me saw it, but I was sure that was a goddamn deer. A buck, to be precise. Something told me that if it was closer, it would have had cold blue eyes. It stared at me. Not in my direction, it was looking at me. Even from that distance, I could feel its glare like a physical presence, and I felt cold sweat begin to run down my brow. I looked away from it, focusing on the professor and trying to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd just seen, but I couldn't lie to myself. I couldn't deny the truth of it. Even when I finally looked back and saw nothing there, I knew my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. Harlan never made it back to our dorm that night. When I came home from my classes, I would have told him everything, but the room was empty. I'd seen his schedule. He should have been back hours ago. Hell, even if he wasn't in, he would have at least told me where he went, right? I did take a quick walk around the dorm area looking for him. At the time of the night, there weren't many people around. I was well enough alone, and yet I still felt watched. No, more than watched. Stalked. I never found any trace of Arlen. Something tells me I never will. Last night when I got back after my search, I saw a shape through my window. Something tall and standing on its hind legs. Something with antlers and cold blue eyes that shone in the darkness. And while I couldn't stare at it for too long before it vanished, it told me everything I needed to know. Our little hunting trip never really ended, no. We're just not the ones doing the hunting anymore.